how much does welfare or a welfare system actually benefit us as people? Do we become reliant on the state, or is it a way to help those who are less um, fortunate get out of a rut? Is taxation something that we should be doing more of or less of, or in what degrees? When we talk about the economy itself, privatization versus socialization is a hot topic, and we're going to get into it. And I brought some great guests to talk about it tonight. So I'm going to give each of them a brief opening statement, a chance to introduce themselves, and we'll get right into it. We're going to start tonight by passing the ball to Lactoid. And Lactoid, uh, no stranger to my show. Tell people who you are and what your initial thoughts are, and we'll go from there.
Sure. So I'm Lactoid. You can find me at Lactoid TV on Twitch, Twitter, and YouTube. I am a libertarian, and according to some ANCAPs, I'm a socialist. I would consider
Wait, your
myself
Twitter
really.
isn't Lactoid? I thought it was at
No,
Lactoid.
no. In fact, Wick made this mistake, and it turns out at Lactoid is a very different person, which you guys may be interested in following as well, depending on your sexuality. So you can look into that as well, but if you want to. But you can find me at Lactoid TV. That's where you can find me. So I'm a libertarian, according to some ANCAPs. Also a socialist. I'm a lawyer. I am not an economist. I don't have any economist credentials, but I have some pretty strong moral opinions and some general statements to say about the world. So if you like that shit, give me a follow.
Okay, and Econoboy, tell people about yourself, I guess.
Yeah, sure. I guess just a little bit about me. I'm an economics and politics nerd. It's what I went to school for, and I do business now. I guess I went to business school as well, and that's sort of led me to where I am in terms of my political beliefs. In the last few years, I've gotten a significantly deeper interest and understanding in the welfare state and collective ownership and things like that, which has been a really fun research process. If you're interested in policy, you can, of course, subscribe to my channel, and that's just Econoboy and everything. But I recently started a podcast with a couple other wonky people, one named Micah Irfan, who's a neoliberal, and then one named Socialism Done Left, who's a socialist. And of course, I'm sort of the middle ground between the two, a filthy centrist social democrat. And so all three of us talk policy on our podcast called The Three Wonks or Three Wonks. I think it's at Three Wonks on YouTube. And so subscribe if you're interested in dense policy, political discussions.
Okay, well, thank you guys for your introductions. Lactoid, what are your thoughts on a collectivized economy? Give us kind of your initial thoughts, and we'll just go from there.
On a collectivized economy, my general thoughts on the okay, very large question, so I'll do my best to kind of break it up into something I can answer. A collectivized economy, and if we mean things like um, generally an economy focused on the left of the political spectrum, which would be maybe have more of an equity focus an egalitarian focus as opposed to a hierarchical focus. There's different ways you could do this. There's direct state ownership of the economy. There is uh, no state ownership of the economy, but having some kind of taxation system, welfare in place. And generally, I'm opposed to collectivization of the economy on principle due to the fact that um, it relies on stealing, right? Where charity is also could be argued to be some kind of egalitarian purpose to the economy. But what I think the difference in definition between charity and collectivization of the economy comes when you introduce the when you introduce force, when you introduce compulsion into the calculus, when you have it no longer being a voluntary exchange, but when you have it be the powers that be mandate that you give up some of your assets, you give up your time, your labor, um, in order to redistribute that to other people. Um, Maybe this is something that Econoboy will take umbrage with, but I think that I sort of ingest, but I sincerely kind of mean it. economic leftism to me is very similar to it's like an economic way of thinking that's very similar to the way that incels think about sexuality, which is that they aren't getting any, and it's this great injustice, and so then they deserve this whatever they're not getting. But what both incels and leftists, I think, fail to account for, or maybe they don't fail, but they just disagree with me, which is that you don't have a right to other people's stuff and you don't have a right to other people's bodies. So you have to rely on them giving it to you and you providing something in exchange for them giving it to you. And that's the way that a free country should operate.
I'm curious an Econoboy's response to being an economic incel. What are your thoughts here?
The biggest economic insult, I guess. I mean, yeah, I guess to give my overview for like how I think of collectivized economy. So I'm not a socialist, right? So I don't really believe in like full socialization of investment or capital or anything like that. But I do think that taking like the Matt Brunig style view of institutional level socialism or capitalism kind of just makes the most sense to me. I think a lot of people struggle to classify like a country like Cuba, is that a socialist economy? Well, it's not very democratic, but like 70% of their GDP is from state owned enterprises. But what about that other 30%? Like, is that a capitalist economy? Like, people say the same thing about China. Norway, for instance, is an economy where 2/3 of its output comes from collectivized entities. Is that socialism? Well, maybe for the 2/3, but not the 1/3. So I kind of just take an institutional level view. Like if you have a democratically owned sort of state-owned enterprise, I would call that a form of socialist production. I would say the same thing about government services that provide, not necessarily fee for service, but sort of tax for service, like public transit, public schools, the police, fire departments. Again, these are all things that can be provided by a private market, but we've overwhelmingly decided that those are publicly owned entities, right, and democratically owned and accountable. Sovereign wealth fund ownership, employee stock ownership, worker cooperatives, consumer cooperatives. These are all forms of collective ownership. And an economy can be much more on the left side of things, let's say, with 100% of those institutions or, some combination of them. Or they can be further to the right of things where many more of those institutions are privatized, right? And so I think it's really just a matter of which institutions are best for the market and for people in general. I wouldn't necessarily call myself an incel, economically speaking, obviously, mostly because I think that my worldview isn't really based on sort of an individual sort of desert theory of who deserves what just from a sort of intrinsic level. I kind of have some basic moral intuitions that people would probably be better off if they didn't live in poverty. And if it were the case that we could do certain things that weren't distortionary greatly to the market, that didn't destroy wealth to any significant degree, but did in fact alleviate a significant amount of poverty. And, transitively, poverty is human suffering, right? And so, to the degree that we can eliminate that, that's probably good. And it seems like many societies across the world have engaged in some forms of democratic collectivism and also welfare spending, which have led to their societies having higher levels of economic freedom, having lower levels of poverty, lower levels of inequality. And that's sort of the foundational argument that I have, right? Is that if we can do things that lower inequality, maintain economic growth, maintain innovation, but also alleviate poverty and don't destroy the economy, then those things are probably good things to do.
Well, let's get to the brass tacks, right? Instead of general, let's go specific. You mentioned that there are things that we could do, or economies, countries, democracies, states can do in order to alleviate poverty. I'm sorry, poverty. That you would find that
Wow, Freudian
would
slip there. What?
yeah, a little bit. Uh, can you give us a couple examples of things that maybe Biden has done, or maybe Cuba has done, since you mentioned Cuba, or something else, Norway,
Mhm,
another country that you find we would be good to
mhm.
implement here in America?
Yeah, sure. I would say Cuba is quite a bad example of collective ownership because what you find in the literature is that collective entities, whether they be government services, state enterprises, or sovereign wealth funds, sort of collective wealth management, what you find is that it's really bad when autocracies run these things or autocratic institutions. Whereas when you have more transparent democratic institutions running these things, in general, they're held to a sort of higher standard of accountability and transparency, and they don't. There's not as many problems with graft and politicization of these types of assets. And so I would say that Norway is probably the best economy in the world, if I had to say so. I think some of the things that Norway does well, number one, I think that their sovereign wealth fund is like incontrovertibly a good thing for their society. Alaska does the same thing. We have a US state that basically does the same thing as Norway, where what they do is they take resource rents, which is sort of unearned income, and taxes it and puts it into a collective pool of assets. And not only does this diversify the economy away from a very volatile commodity like oil, it also collectivizes to a large extent the returns to natural resources. And it's not really clear that any one person has the sole right to the resource rents associated with natural resources. And what this has done is it's created a wealth fund, which is worth about $270,000 for every single Norwegian adult and child. And that helps significantly with maintaining their economy. If you compare Venezuela to Norway, for instance, they both have state oil companies, but one of these countries collapses every time the oil price goes down, and one of these countries barely notices every time the oil price goes down. It's just good, responsible economic management. I think that their state owned enterprises are also good for a number of reasons. Again, I'm not like a heavy state ownership guy. I think I would focus more on government services and sovereign wealth fund ownership, but those are good things as well. And then cooperative ownership, again, it's just a matter of a strict preference. Like, I think one of the basic principles that I would have is that if society could be more egalitarian in terms of ownership and, let's say, income and wealth, but we don't see, great, sort of terrible outcomes for the economy in terms of growth and innovation, then again, it would be desirable to achieve a more equal economic system of production. I mean, there's just not like an intuitive reason to prefer inequality to equality if we assume that we can maintain technological advancement and like general economic growth, right? At least that's where I sort of come from.
In response to that, Blackwood?
So I guess I'll just address the second thing that was said first when it comes to cooperative ownership. I think Econoboy actually really, really hit it on the head when he said this is more of a preference thing, right? Because when we're talking about things like equity or an egalitarian system, there's no right or wrong answer, in the math as to like which of these two is quote unquote better, right? Better is more of a normative statement of what kind of world do we want to live in, right? What kind of policies do we want to implement? And I I hate to go back to this example, but I'm going to keep on going back to it because I think it's funny, which is that the incel, like economic incelism, incelism in of itself is very much focused on egalitarianism in the same right. It's this concept of, well, you have the top 1%, they're having all this sex and the rest of us aren't getting any. This is bullshit. We got to like make this equal. But the reason why I like this example even better is because it really highlights, even the most ardent leftist is going to hate this policy. I'm sure Econoboy is against like incels. Most of us, most reasonable people are. But the reason I think why it's such a good example is because it really highlights the fact that this equity comes at a price, right? This equity comes at taking or controlling somebody else's body, right? And all assets, the rights to assets come from the labor that goes into them, and come from a complex series of contracts that make up any kind of capitalist society. So just simply saying, well, we got to make we got to make everything egalitarian. Um, you know, it depends on how it's done, right? If you're going to be using the government to collectivize things and to steal and redistribute people's property or bodies or their time or whatever, um, I think this is morally wrong, right? I have a strong dispreference towards this. I dislike this tremendously. If, on the other hand, you have some people get together and form a worker co-op, right, where they were like, let's all just get together and each own a company, like each own part of the company, because really all a worker co-op is a regular company, except ownership is restricted to its workers. I don't necessarily have a problem with that. I don't have an issue with that. I don't have an issue with consumer, where the consumer is the owner of companies. So examples of that are like a mutual insurance company. I've got no problem with that, right? As long as it's set up in a consensual way. And I think that's kind of going to be my critical sticking point, where if you want to set up these institutions to be like in a consensual manner, to be consensual, I have no problem with that. But the moment you start taking and demanding to use things that belong to somebody else, that's where you're going to run into a lot of issues with me.
Yeah, I mean, I think that again, I'm relatively outcome oriented, right? So I'm open to the idea that having a nearly entirely privatized sort of system of governance is a good thing. I think I said on my podcast recently that I think a lot of people they come to issues as their ideology, and then they map solutions onto issues, which is probably wrong. Rather, what I've done is I've tried to say basically, what does the research say in terms of outcomes for various things? Okay, the research says these things are probably good, and these things sort of cluster together, and that's why I call myself a SOCDEM. That seems to be where I kind of end up, right? And so the reason I mention that is because it seems like when you look into the empirical outcomes of welfare programs and, like, let's say well-run sort of governance models of ownership, like government services and state-owned enterprise and things like that, and sovereign wealth funds, of course, as well. You don't really seem to have a significant problem with graft or sort of political intrigue or anything like this into these programs. There's some level of scandals. Like when I was reading for this debate, I think I read that at some point Norway reformed their governance model. I want to say this was maybe in the 60s, where one of their state-owned enterprises had government bureaucrats on the board, and there was this big explosion at one of their plants, and so everyone kind of took a big kick in the pants politically from that. And so the politicians basically decided, well, we probably don't want to deal with this accountability. And it's also probably bad for governance. And so they made that reform to where basically people in the government couldn't also serve as directors of boards, even for state-owned enterprises, right? And so there's all kinds of models that you can do to try and insulate these assets from political sort of vulnerability. And then when it comes to the outcomes of like welfare programs, I mean, even in the US, which has a very fragmented and very poor welfare system, I mean, if you look at the sort of after benefits poverty rates in the US, I have some statistics here from 1967 to 2020. Population poverty went from 18% to 11% in that period. That's about a 50% reduction. Childhood poverty went from 20% to 9.8%. It's about a 100% decrease, or no, that's a 50% decrease, I should say. Worker poverty, so poverty for workers, goes from 13.9 to 9%. And then elderly poverty goes from about 37.5% all the way down to 9.6%, right? And so these are all good things, right? I think it's good when people don't live in poverty. And again, insofar as we can provide transfers to people that don't harm economic growth, that don't hurt innovation, but actually bolster innovation, because oftentimes, I mean, how are you going to become an Einstein if you have no access to capital or education from a young age? Obviously, this is very bad for society. I would say that those programs are good. And I mean, if you're willing to concede that, like, yeah, the studies show that these things are really, really good at reducing poverty, but I still would say that they're wrong. We can have that conversation, but the empirical conversation, I think, is, at least more important, because at the end of the day, like, intuitively, every country on the planet has taxation and welfare programs. This is not a moral intuition that's shared by 99.9% of people. The idea that taxation is slavery, I'm enslaved when you tax me. I mean, again, if this was a broadly held intuition, we'd probably see governance be radically different than it is now. And at the very least, I would say also that there doesn't seem to be any movement towards this type of thing. So like what you might say is, oh, well, people used to think slavery was bad, and look at where we are now. And it's like, well, yeah, but it seems like the course of human history was a slow decoupling of slavery from the economy, which led to civil wars in some places, and then also just reforms in other places to get rid of slavery. But when it comes to social spending and collectivization, it seems like the trends are quite the opposite. It seems like we have a massive growth from the early 1900s to today in the percentage of the economy that's dedicated towards social services. And of course, in many countries, the amount of collectivization, sort of democratic collectivization, let's say, in the economy. And so if you're willing to engage in the empirics, I'd love for you to do that. If not, then we can have this more philosophical debate.